The twin suns burned over the endless sand, casting long shadows of broken machines and twisted metal. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the outpost. The air was heavy with the smell of scorched armor and burned circuits. Corporal Daniel Reeve stepped over a half-buried drone, his boots crunching against shards of glass. His visor scanned for movement, but the battlefield was quiet now. Too quiet. He had been separated from his unit hours ago during the attack. The enemy had moved fast, overwhelming their lines before reinforcements could arrive. Daniel had fought through the chaos, but the sandstorm that followed had erased all signs of friend or foe. Alone, he pressed on, following the faint signal. His HUD displayed. It wasn't human, it was alien. He found her half buried under the wreckage of a fallen gunship. The alien girl's armor was cracked, and dark blue blood seeped from a wound along her side. Her breathing was shallow. Her helmet was gone, revealing her smooth azure skin, framed by strands of silver hair that caught the sunlight like threads of metal. Her eyes were barely open, their violet hue dulled by exhaustion. Daniel hesitated. Her kind had fought against humans for years. They weren't allies. But the way she looked at him, weak, helpless, and almost afraid, wasn't the gaze of an enemy soldier. He knelt beside her and began clearing the debris. "You're going to be fine," he said, though he wasn't sure she understood his words. Her lips moved, whispering something in her language. The translation module in his armor struggled to keep up. The words it gave back were broken. "All gone. Left me." Daniel glanced at the horizon. No movement, no rescue. No one else. He knew what she meant. Her people had abandoned her here. When he lifted her into his arms, she flinched but didn't resist. The metal plates of her armor were cold against his chest, but her faint trembling told him she was still alive. He could feel her heartbeat, weak but steady. He carried her toward the nearest shelter. He could find a collapsed transport that had enough cover from the sun and wind. The heat outside was brutal, but inside the wreckage it was cooler, shadows shielding them from the glare. He set her down carefully, removing a small med kit from his armor. Her breathing hitched when he applied the sealant foam to her wound. The blue liquid hissed and hardened, slowing the bleeding. She didn't speak, only watched him with half-lidded eyes, as if trying to understand why a human would help her at all. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling loose metal. Daniel knew he couldn't stay here long. The sandstorms were unpredictable, and scavenger drones would arrive soon, stripping the battlefield of anything useful, including the living. He tried contacting command again, but the comms were dead. Whatever had hit this outpost had fried. The long-range transmitters. That meant there was no backup coming for either of them. The alien girl stirred, trying to sit up, but he gently pressed her back down. "Don't move, you're injured." She shook her head weakly, gesturing toward the east. Her voice came soft, broken by pain. The translator caught fragments. "Not safe, hunters. Coming." Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened. Hunters. That meant enemy scavenger squads, those who roamed after battles, killing survivors and collecting trophies. If she was right, they didn't have much time. "Can you walk?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded faintly. He helped her to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, her steps unsteady but determined. Every few paces she would glance back, as though expecting to see shadows moving in the heat. They made their way to a ridge of black stone jutting out of the sand. Daniel knew from his training that these rock formations often hid old maintenance tunnels from before the war. If they could find one, it might give them cover until nightfall. Halfway there, his HUD flickered with motion alerts. Shapes were moving along the far edge of the battlefield, 6, maybe 7 figures, moving fast. The girl stiffened beside him. She didn't need to say it. The hunters had arrived. Daniel adjusted his grip on his rifle and quickened his pace, keeping the girl close. Her breathing was ragged, but she didn't slow. They reached the base of the ridge just as the first distant shots cracked through the air, sending up plumes of sand around them. He pulled her into the shadow of the rocks, scanning for an entrance. His heart sank when he realized the nearest tunnel entrance was half collapsed. Still, it was better than nothing. He guided her inside, the dim light swallowing them as the outside world became a muffled blur of wind and gunfire out in the cool darkness. She leaned against the wall, her eyes finding his again. For a moment, there was no war. No sides, only the silent understanding between two survivors who had no one else left. Daniel took a slow breath, listening to the distant echoes of pursuit outside. He didn't know why he had chosen to help her when every rule of war said he shouldn't. All he knew was that he wasn't going to leave her behind. Not now, not ever. The tunnel walls were rough and cold against Daniel's gloves. He kept his rifle ready, listening for the sounds of footsteps or metal scraping in the distance. The air smelled of dust and rust, a reminder that this place had been abandoned long before the war reached it. The alien girl leaned on him as they moved deeper. Her breathing was heavy, each step a struggle. The blue light from her armor flickered, casting faint shadows on the walls. Daniel could see she was fighting to stay conscious, but she refused to stop. "Slow down," he said quietly. She shook her head, whispering something. The translator lagged before giving him the meaning. "If we stop, they find us." Her voice was so weak that Daniel had to lean closer to hear it. Still, there was a sharpness in her eyes as stubborn. Well, that reminded him of soldiers who refused to give in, even when they were outnumbered. They reached a fork in the tunnel. One path sloped upward, possibly toward the surface. The other dropped down into darkness. Daniel hesitated. The lower tunnel might hide them better, but it could also be a dead end. The girl pointed downward without a word. Daniel didn't question her. She had probably been here before, or at least knew more about these tunnels than he did. The descent was slow. Dust drifted in the air, disturbed by their footsteps. Somewhere above them, faint metallic sounds echoed too. Distant to be the hunters yet, but close enough to remind Daniel that time was running out. After what felt like an hour, they emerged into a large chamber. Rusted machines stood like sleeping giants against the walls, their shapes half hidden in the dark. The floor was scattered with old crates, some still sealed. Daniel scanned the room for threats, then motioned for her to sit on one of the crates. She sank down, clutching her side. The wound was holding, but she was pale, her blue skin dimmed to a softer, almost grayish tone. He knelt in front of her, checking the sealant. "You need water," he said. She blinked slowly, as if she understood. Daniel pulled a small canteen from his pack and offered it to her. She took it carefully, sipping in slow, measured gulps. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Why, help me?" The translator's mechanical tone repeated the question in his language. Daniel thought about it. He could have left her on the battlefield. No one would have known. No one would have cared. "Because I don't leave people behind," he said finally. She studied him for a long time, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then she whispered her name, soft, musical, almost like a breath. The translator gave him something close to Kayla. "Kayla," he repeated. She nodded faintly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The sound of movement snapped his attention back to the tunnels. This time it was closer. The hunters were tracking them, moving carefully, as if they knew their prey was near. Daniel motioned for silence and moved toward the far wall, looking for another exit. He found a narrow service shaft partly hidden behind a pile of crates. It was tight, barely wide enough for one person, but it might lead them away from the main tunnel paths. He turned back to Kayla. "We have to move." She stood slowly, leaning on him for balance. Her armor scraped against the metal as she squeezed into the shaft. Daniel followed, his rifle awkward in the cramped space. They crawled for several meters before the shaft opened into another passage. This one was narrower, lined with old cables that hung like dead vines from the ceiling. Daniel could feel the cooler air here. It meant they were moving deeper underground. Suddenly, Kayla froze. Her eyes widened, and she pressed herself against the wall. Daniel followed her gaze and saw faint red lights moving ahead in the dark. Not hunters, drones. The drones floated silently, their scanning beams sweeping the corridor. These weren't scavengers. They were security drones from before the war, programmed to destroy anything they didn't recognize. Daniel grabbed Kayla's arm and pulled her back into the shaft. The red lights passed by, their beams brushing over the entrance but not detecting them. They waited until the hum faded before moving again. When they finally reached another chamber, Kayla collapsed against the wall. "I can't," she whispered. Daniel knelt beside her, checking her vitals. She was fading fast. Without proper medical care, she wouldn't last the day. He thought about his options. Staying here meant certain death. Going back risked. Running into the hunters. There had to be another way. Kayla opened her eyes just enough to meet his gaze. "There's a place," she said softly. The translator repeated her words. "Safe. If we can reach river tunnels." Daniel didn't know where those were, but he knew one thing: he was going to get her there, no matter how far, no matter who stood in their way. Outside the tunnel, the sound of distant gunfire echoed again, closer this time. The hunters weren't giving up. Daniel tightened the straps of his pack, lifted Kayla into his arms, and started moving. Every step echoed through the darkness, carrying them deeper into the unknown. And still, he refused to let go. The air grew colder as Daniel carried Kayla through the twisting tunnels. The sound of his boots against the metal grated in the silence. Every few minutes he stopped, listening for signs of pursuit. Sometimes there was nothing. Other times, faint echoes reminded him that the hunters were still on their trail. Kayla's head rested against his shoulder. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle. The glow from her armor dimmed further, flickering like a dying flame. Daniel knew she didn't have much strength left. He turned a corner and found himself in a long passage where the walls dripped with condensation. The stale smell of water filled the air. Somewhere ahead, he could hear a faint trickle. If this was the river tunnel Kayla spoke of, it might be their best chance. "Almost there," he murmured. She didn't respond, but her hand tightened weakly against his armor, as if she understood. The tunnel widened into a cavern. A shallow stream ran along one side, its dark surface reflecting dim patches of light from cracks in the ceiling. The air here was damp and cool, a welcome relief from the dry heat above. Daniel set Kayla down near the water, kneeling beside her. "Drink," he said, filling his canteen and offering it to her. She took a few small sips, her lips trembling. As she handed it back, for the first time since he'd found her, she spoke more than a few words. "You risk everything. Why?" The translator repeated the question in his language. Daniel's eyes drifted to the stream. He thought about all the missions he'd been on, all the lives he hadn't been able to save. "Because I've seen too many people left behind," he said quietly. "I won't let it happen again." Kayla's violet eyes studied him, unreadable. Then she looked down, whispering something in her own tongue that the translator couldn't catch. Her voice sounded almost like a prayer. A sound cut through the stillness, the sharp clatter of metal striking stone. Daniel's rifle was in his hands before he even thought about it. From the shadows at the far end of the cavern, movement stirred. Two hunters emerged, their armor dark and jagged, faces hidden behind mirrored masks. They carried long rifles, the kind designed to pierce through thick plating. One raised his weapon toward Kayla. Daniel fired first. The shot echoed through the cavern, striking the hunter in the chest and knocking him backward into the stream. The second hunter dropped low, returning fire. Sparks flew as the bullet glanced off the rock beside Daniel's head. He ducked behind. A boulder, firing again. The second hunter moved fast, using the shadows for cover. Kayla, still on the ground, reached for something at her side. Her fingers found a small blade hidden in her armor. When the hunter rushed forward, Kayla swung upward, the blade slicing through the gaps in his armor. He staggered back, dropping his weapon. Daniel didn't hesitate. One more shot ended it. Cavern fell silent again, broken only by the steady sound of water. Daniel lowered his rifle, his breath heavy. He turned to Kayla. She was pale, her hands trembling, but there was a spark in her eyes now. "You saved me," he said. She gave a faint nod, though it was clear she had used the last of her strength. Daniel dragged the bodies of the hunters into the shadows, taking their ammo and anything useful. It wouldn't be long before more came looking for them. Kayla motioned toward a narrow opening behind the stream. "River goes far," the translator said. "Safe, for now." Daniel helped her to her feet, guiding her into the passage. The water was cold, soaking into his boots as they waded forward. The tunnel was just tall enough for him to stand upright, the sound of flowing water echoing in every direction. Hours seemed to pass as they moved through the twisting waterways. Sometimes the light from above would filter in through cracks, painting the walls in pale blue. Other times, they were swallowed in total darkness, guided only by touch and sound. Finally, the tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller, but warm from geothermal vents in the rock. Steam curled up from the ground, filling the air. With a faint mineral scent, Daniel lowered Kayla to the ground. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes half closed. "Rest," he told her. He kept watch, scanning the tunnel entrance for movement. Every so often, he caught himself glancing at her, not with suspicion, but with a strange sense of responsibility he couldn't explain. Somewhere deep in his mind, he knew that helping her wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving something to himself, to the galaxy, maybe even to her, that trust could exist between enemies. Kayla's breathing slowed as she drifted toward sleep. Daniel stayed awake, listening to the quiet, knowing it wouldn't last. The hunters would keep searching, and when they found them, he'd be ready. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the dark tunnel entrance. The faint sound of the river was the only thing breaking the stillness. Every so often, a drip of water from the ceiling echoed in the chamber, sharp enough to make him tense. Kayla stirred in her sleep, shifting slightly against the wall. The warmth from the geothermal vents seemed to have given her a little color back, though her breathing was still slow. Daniel knew they couldn't stay here for long. The hunters had already proven they could track them. He checked his ammunition half. A magazine in his rifle, 2 spare clips in his pack. Not enough for a prolonged fight. If they ran into a large squad, he'd have to rely on luck and the terrain. Kayla's eyes opened slowly. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You, not like others." The translators. Flat tone carried the meaning, but Daniel could see in her face that the words were heavy with thought. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. Her gaze didn't waver. "Your kind, soldiers, would kill me. You protect." Daniel shrugged. "War makes people see enemies instead of lives. I'm not interested in killing someone just because they're on the other side." Kayla's lips curved into the smallest smile he'd seen from her yet, but it faded quickly when a distant metallic thud echoed through the tunnel. Daniel was on his feet instantly, rifle raised. The sound came again, steady, deliberate footsteps. He moved closer to Kayla, helping her stand. She leaned on him, her armor scraping against his dot. The steps grew louder. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide their approach. That meant confidence. Or a trap. A shadow appeared in the tunnel, tall and broad. Then another, and another. 3 figures in dark hunter armor stepped into the faint light. Their mirrored masks reflected Daniel's stance back at him, the lead. Hunter raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Daniel dropped to one knee and shot first. The bullet hit the mask, shattering the reflective surface. The hunter fell backward, his weapon clattering into the stream. The other two split apart, one taking cover behind the boulder, the other moving wide to flank. Daniel fired again, forcing the flanker to duck. The confined space of the chamber turned. Every shot into a deafening roar. Kayla, still weak, crouched behind the vent stones, pulling the blade from her armor. Her eyes tracked the movement of the hunter behind the boulder. Daniel took a risk. He moved out from cover, drawing their attention. The flanker fired, grazing his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he kept moving, pressing the trigger. The hunter staggered and fell into the water. The last hunter charged from behind the boulder, rifle aimed. Kayla moved before Daniel could react, throwing her blade with surprising force. It struck the hunter's shoulder joint, piercing through the armor. He dropped his weapon, stumbling forward. Daniel closed the distance and finished it with a single strike to the chest plate. The hunter went still. The chamber was silent again, save for the sound of rushing blood in Daniel's ears. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. His shoulder burned, but the wound wasn't deep. Kayla approached slowly, retrieving her blade from the fallen hunter. She handed it back to him without a word, her eyes steady. "We have to keep moving," Daniel said after a moment. "More will come," she nodded. "River leads to old station. Maybe safe." They waded back into the narrow waterway, following its winding path. Hours passed, their only light coming from the faint glow of cracks above and the occasional glimmer from Kayla's armor. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. At its center stood the remnants of an ancient station, rusted walkways, collapsed platforms, and a single central tower leaning slightly to one side. Daniel scanned the area. It was quiet, too quiet. No sign of recent activity. They climbed onto one of the old walkways, the metal groaning under their weight. The air here was warmer, thicker with the smell of rust and damp stone. Inside the tower, Daniel found a control room covered in dust. Most of the panels were dead, but one terminal flickered faintly. He wiped it clean, pressing a few keys. The screen came to life with static before stabilizing into an old system interface. Kayla stepped beside him, her eyes scanning the text. "Old maintenance network," she murmured. "Might connect to surface beacons." Daniel's pulse quickened. If they could send a signal, they might be able to call for extraction, or at least warn his unit. But before they could try, a faint hum filled the air. Kayla froze, her expression darkening. "Not alone," she whispered. Daniel turned toward the walkway they'd crossed. Shapes were moving in the shadows, more hunters, and this time, there were many. He glanced at Kayla, then at the terminal. "We hold them off long enough to send the signal," he said. She drew her blade again, her posture steady despite her exhaustion. "Then we make them regret finding us." The hum grew louder, echoing through the metal skeleton of the station. Daniel counted at least 8 hunters moving along the walkways, their mirrored masks catching the dim light. They advanced slowly, confident in their numbers. Daniel's hands tightened around his rifle. The terminal behind him continued to flicker, the ancient system straining to boot up fully. They needed more time. Kayla stood at his side, her blade drawn, her armor cracked but her eyes sharper than ever. "I hold them," she said quietly. "You send the signal." Daniel shook his head. "We hold them together." The first hunter opened fire, bullets sparking off the rusted walls. Daniel returned the shot, dropping the attacker instantly. The others spread out, their boots clanging on the walkways as they tried to flank from both sides. Kayla moved like a shadow, slipping between pieces of cover. Her blade flashed, catching the faint light as she cut down a hunter who had crept too close. Blood the color of dark ink splattered against the railings, dripping into the depths below. Daniel felt the station tremble under the fight. Every shot sent vibrations through the corroded structure. Pieces of metal fell into the water far below, the sound swallowed by the dark. The terminal beeped behind him. A progress bar crawled across the screen, marking only 40% complete. His stomach tightened. They were running out of time. A grenade clinked onto the walkway near him. Daniel grabbed it and hurled it over the railing before it could detonate. The explosion lit up the chamber in a blinding flash, shaking the air. Kayla stumbled from the blast wave, but she recovered quickly, slicing through another attacker's leg and sending him crashing to the floor. She kicked his rifle toward Daniel, who caught it in one motion and used it to fire at the approaching flank. More hunters poured in from the shadows, their weapons raised. Daniel dropped one, then another, but the magazine clicked empty before he could take a third. Kayla moved in to cover him, her strikes precise despite her injury. Each motion was fueled by sheer willpower. Daniel grabbed a fresh clip from his pack and reloaded, firing over her shoulder to push the attackers back. Terminal beeped again. 70%. A hunter vaulted the railing from above, landing behind them. Daniel spun, but the hunter was already raising his weapon. Kayla threw herself into the shot, the bullet slamming into her shoulder plate instead of Daniel. She hissed in pain but didn't fall, slashing upward and forcing the attacker over the edge. Daniel's chest tightened, anger burning through him. "Stay behind me," he barked. She shook her head. "We fight together." The walkway trembled under the weight of another explosion. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. As the ancient structure groaned, the hunters seemed unfazed, pressing forward with relentless focus. 90%. Daniel ducked behind the terminal, firing controlled bursts to keep the enemy pinned. Kayla disappeared into the shadows again, her movements unpredictable. A hunter screamed as she cut him down, his body falling limp. The progress bar hit 100. The terminal emitted a long tone, followed by a blinking message. Signal sent. Relief washed over Daniel for only a moment before reality hit. They still had to survive until help arrived. The hunters seemed to realize the same thing. They charged, their boots pounding on the metal. Daniel and Kayla stood side by side, their backs to the terminal. The first attacker lunged for Daniel, and he met him with a burst of fire to the chest. The second swung at Kayla, but she caught his weapon arm and drove her blade through his visor. The fight became a blur of steel, gunfire, and flashing lights. Daniel's rifle grew hot in his hands, and Kayla's blade dripped dark blood. The walkway shuddered under the chaos, threatening to collapse with every impact. Through the noise, Daniel caught the faint thrum of an approaching ship. It was distant, but it was there. Hope, faint as it was, flickered in his mind. Then one of the hunters broke through their defense, slamming into Daniel and knocking his rifle away. The two struggled, fists and elbows striking in desperate bursts. Daniel caught the attacker's arm and forced it back, snapping the elbow with a sharp crack. Kayla stepped in, finishing the hunter with a quick strike. Her breathing was ragged now, each movement slower than before. More shapes emerged from the tunnels, but this time they didn't charge. They hesitated, their mirrored masks turning toward the sound above, the rising roar of engines. Daniel looked at Kayla. Her eyes met his, tired but unwavering. "Hold on," he said, for the first time since he'd found her. She gave him a real smile. The roar of the engines grew louder, rattling the corroded walls of the old station. Bright searchlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the walkways and sending sharp glares off the hunters' mirrored masks. Daniel's chest tightened. The rescue ship had found them, but so had every remaining hunter in the tunnels. Kayla steadied herself beside him, her blade trembling slightly in her grip. "Your people?" she asked through the translator. Daniel nodded. "But we're not safe yet." A grappling line dropped from above, clanging against the metal walkway. The ship hovered just close enough for extraction, but the distance was still too far to cross without drawing fire. The hunters made their move. 4 charged from one side, 3 from the other, their boots pounding against the steel. Bullets and energy blasts tore through the air. Daniel grabbed Kayla's arm and pulled her into cover behind a thick support beam. "They want you alive," Daniel muttered, glancing at the way the hunters avoided direct shots at her. Kayla's jaw tightened. "Not alive, prisoner." The idea burned in Daniel's chest. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not after everything. The walkway shuddered under the fight as Daniel popped out from cover, firing controlled bursts. 2 hunters dropped, but the rest pushed forward. Kayla slipped past him, darting toward the enemy on the right. Her blade flashed in the ship's light, cutting through armor with precise strikes. One hunter swung at her, knocking the blade from her hands. Before he could fire, Daniel slammed into him, sending both crashing into the railing. The hunter toppled over, vanishing into the black water below. The ship's pilot's voice crackled in Daniel's comms. "You've got 30 seconds before we have to pull out. Get on board now." Daniel's eyes swept the walkway. The remaining hunters were closing in fast, their weapons ready. He grabbed Kayla's hand, pulling her toward the grappling line. Shot rang out, striking the metal inches from her head. Daniel turned, firing back until the attacker fell. The walkway groaned, a long crack splitting down its center from the repeated impacts. "Jump!" Daniel shouted. Kayla hesitated only a moment before leaping, grabbing the line. Daniel followed, his shoulders screaming in pain as he caught hold. The ship's winch pulled them up, the station shrinking below, but one of the hunters wasn't done. He leaped from the collapsing walkway, catching Daniel's boot and dragging him down. The line twisted violently. Daniel gritted his teeth, kicking hard. The hunter's grip slipped slightly but held. Kayla, still clinging to the line above him, swung her leg and drove her heel into the hunter's helmet. The blow cracked the visor, sending him plunging into the darkness. They cleared the station's roof, the cold night air washing over them. Daniel hauled himself and Kayla onto the deck, collapsing against the metal. The pilot swung the ship away from the ruins, engines screaming as they climbed higher into the black sky. Below, the station disappeared into shadow. Daniel sat up slowly, looking at Kayla. She was breathing hard, her armor dented and scratched, but she was alive. "You're safe now," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "Safe, because you stayed." He didn't answer right away. In truth, he didn't know why he'd chosen her over his own safety. Maybe it was because he saw something in her, a reflection of every soldier left behind, every life abandoned. Or maybe it was because, in that moment, she was more than an enemy. She was someone who mattered. The pilot called back from the cockpit. "Command wants to know what we're bringing in. They're not going to be happy you risked extraction." For her, Daniel's jaw tightened. "Tell them she's under my protection. If they want to argue, they can do it face to face." Kayla tilted her head slightly. "Your people will accept me?" Daniel looked out at the endless stretch of stars. "I don't know, but I will." For the first time, her shoulders eased. She leaned back against the bulkhead, her eyes closing as the ship cut through the sky. Daniel knew the war wasn't over. The hunters would still be out there. His command would still have questions. But none of that mattered now. He'd made a promise, not in words, but in every action he'd taken since the moment he found her on that battlefield. They had all turned away from her, but he never would.